The February 24th, 2016 Building Code Board of Appeals meeting to order. And would you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? That's your right. Pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And just a reminder to everybody, it's not a very big group, but please turn your cell phones off or put them on silent mode, airplane mode, whatever that is, so that it doesn't beep or ring. Could I get the call to order? Take the roll call. I'm sorry, the roll call of members.
Barnhart.
Here.
Miller.
Here.
Latham.
Here.
Schmidt.
Here.
Wilder.
Here.
Tonight we just have one appeal. It's the Interstate Plastics. They're making an appeal of a stop work order posted on November 3rd of 2015. And Justin, do you start things off by giving an introduction to the project?
So let me jump in there.
You bet.
First off, good evening. Thanks for coming. My name's Warren Wilson. I'm city attorney. I know that this board hasn't met in a fairly long time, so I thought I'd spend a minute talking about public meetings with you so you understand what the process will be like tonight. Once we're done with that, I think we'll move into the hearing. Justin and I will probably tag team that a little bit and work through what we think the issues are based on the appeal letter that was submitted. After that, Interstate will have a chance to speak to you, and then following Interstate's comments, the city will have a chance to rebut anything that they bring up at that point in time. Following that, the board would vote. A majority vote needs to be taken one way or the other. If you want to overturn the decision of the building official, that would require a majority vote of the board. This is a public meeting, an open meeting. There's not many folks here tonight other than the folks that are obviously involved, but it is a public meeting. Given that, your deliberations need to be conducted in the open. So if you have questions for staff or for anyone as we go, feel free to ask them. We need to make sure that we're creating a record here so that people can hear what we're doing. When it comes time for deliberation where you're working through what you want to do, obviously we make those deliberations in the public. We'll not be adjourning to a back room where you take a vote and the vote will happen in public. With that, you do need to select a chairperson for tonight because the board hasn't met for a very long time. We don't really have a chair. I do think that it makes some sense to have someone help you out that may have lived through this process. I know that they've got Mark's name in the middle, and he's sort of taken that role to this point, but that would be the first order of business for the board tonight would be to select a chairperson.
I nominate Mark as chairman. I second that motion.
Do we take a roll call?
Roll call. Barnhart.
Yes.
Miller.
Yes.
Latham.
Abstain.
Schmidt.
Yes.
Wilder.
I vote for Trump.
It's not on the ballot.
Yes.
All right, so unless you have any questions about how the process goes tonight, I think we'll get started. We'll try to get through this as quick as we can. We obviously appreciate everyone coming out tonight, but everyone has lives, so we'll try to get through this as quickly as we can. Obviously, as the chairman introduced this matter tonight, we're here on an appeal of a stop work order that was posted back in November. Essentially, Interstate is constructing what the city considers a storage structure, membrane roof storage structure. Interstate has alleged that they don't believe that the building code applies to those structures, and they've appealed the building code or the building official's determination to you. So that's what we're here to address tonight. See if I can forward this. So obviously your job is to listen to both sides. And if you have as for us, as we're going through it, if you want to stop us as we go and ask questions as we go, that's probably the best way so we don't forget to address them at the end. The building code is a bit specific in your role. You can only overturn the building official's determination if he has misinterpreted or misapplied the applicable code requirements. So tonight you'll be essentially looking at Justin's determination and trying to decide whether or not what he did was in keeping with what the code requirements are. So, since it is an appeal of the building official's determination, you probably ought to know what that is as a place to start. So there's a couple issues that, as we understand it, that are at issue tonight. The first is largely procedural. Does the zoning code definition of structure essentially trump or nullify the building code definition of structure? The second is more nuts and bolts, and that's whether or not the structure is regulated by the IBC or not. Justin, in looking at this, made the determination that the IBC does require that the improvements, that the two codes don't conflict, they go hand in hand, so one doesn't trump the other. Justin also determined that the storage structures are structures that are governed by the code. In reaching that decision, we looked at, does the IBC require that improvements to real property be affixed or attached in some fashion to the ground or not? We don't believe that they do. Also, the structures are being erected on the site, which is sufficient to render them improvements to real property to bring them within the code requirements. So that's essentially the determination that Justin has reached, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. Going back a little bit to the role of the board, Section 113 of the code lays out what happens in an appeal to the board. And what I've provided for you here is the commentary. I'll read through this quickly. It says, an aggrieved party may not appeal a code requirement per se. The intent of the appeal process is not to waive or set aside a code requirement. Rather, it is intended to provide a means of reviewing a building official's decision on an interpretation or application of the code. And then jumping to the commentary for 113.2, this section establishes the grounds for an appeal which claims that the building official has misinterpreted or misapplied a code provision. The board is not allowed to set aside any of the technical requirements of the code. So essentially, this is really a technical argument or discussion about whether or not these structures are regulated by the code or not. And so you're reviewing Justin's determination. I did want to take a little bit of an aside and talk about the code commentary briefly. The commentary, and you probably have all seen it, it's a healthy book. This is like half of it. And it's not it's not the code, it's a companion to the code. It helps to provide some historical and technical background as to why the code drafters did what they did, but it doesn't replace the code. And what the commentary tells us, and that's the last part up here, is readers should note that the commentary is to be used in conjunction with the IBC and not as a substitute. The commentary is advisory only. The code official alone possesses the authority and responsibility for interpreting the code. So Justin is the guy charged with interpreting the code and trying to reach decisions on what we think the code should be. He obviously keeps this. You'll notice it's fairly well used, and it is good information, but it doesn't replace the code. So tonight as we go through this, you'll see typically a citation to both the code and the commentary to help us understand what the code actually says and what was intended for. So away we go. I want to talk about the structures.
What we have here, from what I've been able to see, they have 10 cargo containers. They're 2 deep, as you can see there. As you go through, there's 2 deep. They got a tube frame structure that loops over the top of both of them. From what I've been able to see, it looks like there's a small plate welded to the side of the structure with a hole drilled through it, and then that tube frame structure is bolted to that. And they are set directly down on the ground. As you can see in this picture, they're set down on the ground. It's real hard to see, but the tube frame structure comes over. There's a plate up there welded with a hole drilled through from what I've been able to see. And that's as far as we've got. Eventually what will happen from this structure is there'll be a membrane structure put over the top of that tubing to cover the materials that will be stored inside of that from the first picture you've seen.
You'll notice they're fairly tall structures. They're not insignificant in size. Going back a little bit to you probably have seen them on the freeway. They give you a sense of how large they are. Those pipe coils are stacked too high, and that's what, 2/3 of the way to the top. They're fairly healthy sized structures. So we've talked about that. So let's deal quickly with the procedural question about whether or not the zoning code definition of structure trumps the zoning code definition. The citation here that's been cited to is IBC section 102.2. Obviously, we don't think that that trumps the building code. Here's what the definition actually says, or what the code section actually says. The provisions of this code shall not be deemed to nullify any provisions of local, state, or federal law. As we understand it, I think the argument is essentially that because the zoning code contains a different definition of structure, and that definition was interpreted by the Planning Commission as not to apply to these structures for zoning purposes only, that if we also say that the definition in the building code applies, that somehow that's going to nullify the zoning code definition, which would be contrary to 102.2. I don't think that that's what the code intends, and if you turn to the commentary, I think it sheds some light on that. What the commentary tells us is that in some cases, other laws enacted by the jurisdiction of state or federal government may be applicable to a condition that's also governed by a requirement in the code. And this is where I think specifically addresses what we're talking about. In such circumstances, the requirements of the code are in addition to the other law that is still in effect. So it's not so much a trumping or a replacing of that other definition. They work in concert, they work together, they both apply to the project. So in this instance, in Post Falls, if somebody wants to do a project, they need to comply with the zoning code, they need to comply with the building code. The zoning code obviously covers the land use aspects of the project. The building code obviously covers those aspects that are subject to building safety and building regulation. Did you want to?
Yeah.
As part of this, we'll catch some of this later. Justin's gone a long way to try to make sure we've got this right. He's consulted with Colorado Code Consulting, and they have vast experience in teaching the code, writing books about the code, interpreting the code. And so in trying to make sure we got it right, we sort of asked for a second opinion, and Justin's going to read part of that to you, and we'll hit some of that as we go through tonight.
And this letter here is from Steve Thomas. He's from Colorado Code Consulting. In your guys' packet, you've seen his qualifications, his resume and stuff. Just touch on a couple things. He's been around since the '77 doing codes. He's written 3 international building code books himself. He's certified to do classes all the way across the country, everywhere from over here in Washington, Idaho, clear to Florida. He can go anywhere and do the classes. He's sponsored by International Code Council, the folks that put the books out themselves. What he said on the top that we're just touching about here was, it says, "It is my understanding that the owner took the matter of the city zoning to the city zoning board of appeals, and they deemed that it not be a structure under the zoning code. The code is completely separate from the building code. The building code is adopted by reference in Title 15 of the city code. The zoning regulations are contained in Title 18 within the city code. The zoning code applies to all land and uses thereof within the incorporated boundaries of the city of Post Falls. The building code applies to the construction of buildings or structure. There is no relation between the two regulations. One regulates land use and the other regulates construction of buildings or structures." And that was a definition, his interpretation from he goes to all of the code collaborative meetings. He sits in and he can tell you exactly almost why every code section's been put in this book.
So summing that piece of it up again, so again, we think that the code commentary is pretty clear on this point. When there's 2 codes, they both apply, essentially, and that's what the commentary tells us. Any questions on this procedural stuff before we move into structural definition? Good to go. All right, moving on then. So the next question, obviously, is this a structure that's regulated by the IBC? We obviously believe that it is. The definition contained in the IBC is that which is built or constructed. The commentary tells us that this definition is intentionally broad. The code drafters wanted it to be a broad term. It wanted to pull within the scope of the building code everything that's built as an improvement to real property. That is by design a very broad definition. They wanted it to apply broadly. There's a cross-reference to the scope provisions, which also sheds some more light on this. So moving to the scope definition, the provisions of this code shall apply to, and note the highlighted words here, construction, alteration, relocation, enlargement, replacement, repair, equipment, use and occupancy, location, demolition of any appurtenances of every building or structure or any appurtenances to buildings or structures. again, so it's got action words involved. You've done something to bring yourself within the scope of the code. The commentary tells us this section establishes when the regulations contained in the code must be followed, whether in whole or in part. Something must happen, be it a construction of a new building, modification to an existing building, or allowing a building to become unsafe for the code to be applicable. While such activity may not be as significant as a new building, and it uses a fence as an example, saying a fence is a structure that would be subject to the code. So you have to take some action to come within the code, but it doesn't have to be a huge action. It could be as simple as erecting a fence. So remember those highlighted terms as we go to the next slide. And so the question is, has Interstate taken any action outlined in section 101.2 that would bring them within the scope of the code? Well, let's think about that a little bit. They located the shipping containers in a fashion to serve as walls for a structure. So that was one of the words that the code uses. They've also begun to alter those structures by attaching a roof structure, constructing a roof structure that's going to enlarge the storage capacity. Two more words that are used. We know from the code that storage is a use or occupancy that's regulated by the code. It's probably an S1 or an S2 category depending on what they store there. So we know that that's also within the code definition. So looking at this on its face, this alone I think would drive a determination that the structure falls within the building code. They meet the scoping requirements of the code. So that's kind of our punchline, our starting point. That's where we initially say this is a structure subject to the code. Interstate has made a little bit finer argument saying that that's well and good, but they don't feel it's an improvement to real property. So in deciding that question, we considered several items, and Justin looked at a lot of things, and we already mentioned checking in with Colorado Code Consulting. So we're going to walk through some of the things that we looked at. While they don't directly apply to the situation, there are other instances where improvement to real property has come up in Idaho, either in Idaho code or in case law, that gives us some examples to look to and trying to decide whether or not a building or a structure is an improvement to real property. The first thing we looked at is a case from the Idaho Supreme Court from back in 1992. And admittedly, this is interpreting a different statutory scheme, but it's instructive to look at how the Supreme Court answered the question. The court says the question of whether the installation of a reverse switch in a piece of equipment was an improvement is readily resolved, and they turn to the dictionary. An improvement is an enhancement or augmentation of the value or quality, citing to the dictionary. Here, the reverse switch enhanced the value of the granulator by allowing it to be cleaned with greater ease. The installation of the switch was an improvement to real property. So they look at, does the improvement, the so-called improvement, does it enhance or augment the value or quality of the equipment, the property? Here, I think the answer is yeah. If there was no enhancement to the value or the use of that property, probably isn't a reason to construct the new structures. There must be a reason for that to be constructed, and providing the storage. And I think Colorado Code Consulting weighed in on this one as well.
They did. I sent Steve Thomas an email and asked him to weigh in on the definition structure and the real property in there, and his response back was, I have reviewed the language in the commentary regarding the definition of structure. I would argue that the work that is being done is being built as an improvement of real property. The land is real property, and the construction of the arched roof structures is improving the property by providing covered areas for this business. The work that they are doing is definitely not taking away from the real property, so I would use this as a further support my opinion in my previous letter. The commentary also refers back to the definition of building. The commentary says that the building is used to identify those structures that provide shelter for a function or activity. It is clear that the arched roofs will be sheltering some function or activity. Therefore, it also meets the definition of building. And that's from Steve Thomas at Colorado Code Consulting again.
We'll get to the building definition in just a second. And as it talked about briefly, the occupancy classification is S1 or S2. It's a storage use. Moving along. So in their packet, Interstate provided to us a personal property record from the assessor's office for 2015 that listed several storage units on the attachment. It's unclear to us whether that's referring to the containers or not, because it doesn't say, but if we'll just assume that they are. when you turn into the statute, it appears that putting the roof structure on them essentially converts them from personal property to improved real property for tax purposes, and we'll walk through that briefly here. This is the definition used in Idaho Code for property tax assessment purposes. What the statute defines improvements as is improvements means all buildings, structures, manufactured homes, mobile homes, modular homes, erected upon or affixed to land, fences, water ditches, fixtures and floating homes, whether or not such improvements are owned separately from the ownership of the land upon which the same may be erected, affixed, or attached. It also includes fruit and nut-bearing ornamental trees, vines not of natural growth, growing upon the land. So again, a fairly broad definition. Here you'll again notice the highlighted words. It doesn't require the structure be affixed to the property. It doesn't have to be a fixture. It doesn't have to be attached. It says erected upon or affixed, and then later erected, affixed, or attached. So erected has to be something different than affixed or attached. It has to mean something differently. So here, it doesn't require that it be a fixture. What they're constructing out on the site, I think they're erecting a roof on top of a fairly large storage structure. So to me, that seems to be pretty clear that it falls within that definition. We checked in with the assessor's office on this. They confirmed that this is the statute that governs how real property is assessed for property taxes. And it does apply to items erected on real property as well as items affixed to real property. They, by policy, are using a narrower definition than that, but they did confirm that statewide in statute, that is the definition, and it would apply to both fixtures, items attached, as well as items erected on real property. So again, it seems pretty clear looking at that definition, as if we're using that to help guide us in how we want to interpret the building code, that this term or this structure that's being constructed would meet that definition as well. So there's one other definition in Idaho Code that we took a look at. This one is fairly broad as well. It defines improved real property for purposes of what insurance companies can invest in. They can invest in certain things and not others. And so it defines improved real property in this case as real estate upon which improvements or improvements under construction or in the process of construction which are suitable for residential, institutional, commercial, or industrial uses are situated. So it doesn't focus in on whether those structures are affixed or attached to real estate. It focuses in on the use. Are you building a building or structure that's suitable for residential, industrial, institutional uses? Here, obviously, the answer is yes. This is an industrial use in a commercial zone where they're manufacturing pipe and storing them. That is, again, a regulated under the building code occupancy. It's a commercial industrial use, so it would meet that definition as well. So a bit of a recap. In helping to guide his decision, Justin has considered what does the IBC say about the affixed, attached issue. The IBC doesn't require it. It focuses in on, did you take some action that's going to lead you to a regulated use? The dictionary definition used by the Supreme Court also doesn't get into the affixed attached. It looks at, did you do something that's adding value or efficacy to the process that you're looking at? For the property tax purposes, again, doesn't get into the affixed attached. It can be affixed, it can be attached, or it can be erected under that code. And then finally, in the last definition coming out of state code, again, it doesn't focus on that. It focuses on the use of the structures that you're constructing. So taking all of that into consideration along with the second opinion that we received from Colorado Code Consulting, Justin was pretty comfortable in saying, yeah, this is a structure that falls within the code. It doesn't seem to be that much of a stretch to us where we're sitting at. So that's kind of where we're at. We thought it might be instructive to walk through a few examples. So I got on the Googles and I pulled up some examples of shipping container structures that are being constructed throughout the country. I thought we'd walk through the analysis a little bit. So here's a home that's just in the process of being constructed. So is this a structure for building code purposes? In this case, if the distinction comes down to the erected versus affixed, This one probably meets both. I mean, it looks like it's sitting on a foundation. They've added a roof, which would be similar to what we're seeing here. They're adding a roof structure. So this one probably meets either test. How about this one? This one doesn't have an added roof structure. It doesn't appear to be sitting on a foundation. It appears to just, it's sitting on the ground. So if the answer really is this a fixed versus erected dichotomy, this home wouldn't be regulated. The other home that serves the exact same purpose would be regulated by the code. That seems to be a strange result to me. Here's another one. This one, a fairly basic home. It's two stacked, 4 containers stacked 2 high, pretty nominal windows. Looking at the photo, it appears to be on a foundation. It could just be a pad, but it looks to be on a foundation to me. So this one would fall within the code. This one maybe not. Another home, really basic in this instance. I can't tell. I would guess that's not an engineered foundation looking at it. It appears that it's sitting on piers of some sort. This one potentially wouldn't fall into the code if that's the answer, if it is driven by that erected versus attached. Let's move into more storage facilities that look more like what we're dealing with tonight. This, it's hard to see in the photo, but zooming into it, it doesn't appear to be on a foundation. It appears to be set on asphalt. It's, what, 4 high, fairly large structure. So would that fall within the building code? If it's, the issue really boils down to, is it erected versus attached? Probably go either way. I mean, given that center column stuff they're doing it, you'd probably argue that it's affixed to the property, but I think you go either way. This one looks a whole lot like what we're dealing with. This one's stacked 2 high instead of just having 1 high, but it's got the same membrane roof structure, not on a foundation. So should this be regulated by the building code? I would argue if this is going to be regulated, this ought to be regulated as well. I mean, it's serving this, it's the same occupancy group, the same style of construction, membrane roofs in each case. It's a little bit different configuration, but it's a membrane roof in each case. Again, it seems to me to be unusual that the building code would get to one but not the other when there really are identical styles of construction using the same types of materials. That seems to be a strange outcome to me. Finally, getting back to the other definitions that Justin had referenced, building definition, any structure used or intended to be used to support or shelter any use or occupancy. We already discussed it's probably an S1 or S2 use and occupancy. The other thing to keep in mind that this is a type of specialty construction that's specifically called out in the code. It's a membrane-covered frame structure, and being a non-pressurized building wherein the structure is composed of a rigid framework to support a tensioned membrane which provides the weather barrier, which lends me to wonder, if it's not subject to the code, why is there specific regulations to address this style of construction in the code? With that, again, we asked for the second opinion. Stephen Thomas provided that. Is there anything else you wanted to read out of?
No, I think right now, I think we're all right.
So again, he concurred with our initial interpretation. So given that, Justin concluded that it is a structure. It falls within the IBC. None of the other examples of definitions for improved real property seem to change that. We were open to that, but it doesn't seem to suggest that it has to be something different. So given that, we concluded that it is a structure within the code. We obviously want to see Interstate be successful. We'd love to see them complete this project and be in business for a long time and doing good for the city. However, we do believe they need to pull a building permit prior to completing the project. So we believe that Justin's decision as the building official is reasonable, and we think it's supported with the code. We think it's supported by the other definitions we've looked at, and as such, we think that the appeal should be denied. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have before we turn it over to, looks like, Mr. Tipton.
I'm still curious on the terminology you were using between affixed and, what was the other?
So let's go back to probably to this one. So for tax purposes, the code applies to, or it says, you're an improvement to real property, whether the structure has been just simply erected on the property or whether it's been physically attached in some manner. When I get back to my, over there, I've got a printout of some of the other definitions of affixed. And that really means that you've done something to physically attach it to the real property in a way that would be destructive to the property if you wanted to remove it. So to be erected has to mean something different. There's a maxim of, when you're looking at statutes and trying to decide what they mean, the courts will always tell you that if there's multiple words used, they can't mean the same thing, because they assume that whoever drafted the code intended each word to mean something specific. So in this case, they say affixed and attached. So those would be really dealing with situations where one affixed would be a fixture, which is sort of a term of art. I think we're all sort of used to what a fixture is. Mm-hmm. Attached means something that's physically attached to the real property. So what does that leave for erected to mean? And you look at what would a dictionary tell you what erect means? It means to raise, sort of the barn raising. Mm-hmm. You've erected, you built something up from the ground. Here, they're erecting a roof structure on top of these storage containers. They're combining them in a way that renders them into a new style of construction. In some ways, it's no different than building any other storage structure. It's just that they're using different materials.
Do we have any definition of real property? Did I miss that?
Real property is essentially dirt.
Okay.
And I can read that to you when I get back over there from this code. And we looked at these really as guidance. They're not directly applicable, almost going back to the question about the zoning code versus building code. These definitions aren't directly applicable, but we thought it was, well, let's look and see what other codes say, so make sure that we're getting this right. But so real property is essentially the dirt.
The dirt. Can I ask a question in a scenario?
Sure.
From a mortgaging standpoint, I understand, like mobile homes, for instance, if they're on an axle, if they're on wheels, they're not considered real property, correct? But if they're affixed to the property, it becomes real property? That's my understanding.
And I think there's some truth to that. Maybe I'll answer it this way. There's modular buildings are referred to in this list.
Okay.
Modular buildings, when they're constructed, they're inspected by the state. They're not inspected by the local jurisdiction. However, once you bring them in and put them on site, putting the foundations are inspected by the city. And if you want to do an alteration to that structure, you want to do something different to that structure, that goes through the city's building department. So once you've brought it in and put it on the property and set it up, it then becomes the obligation of Justin and his crew to review it and make sure that it's up to snuff.
And to touch on, back on Steve's, his definition is exactly what Warren has stated there. It just says the land is the real property and the construction of the arched roof structures is the improvement to the property. So that's how.
So my question then is, it's all based on the roof.
I think that's the biggest issue. I think going back again, let's go back here for a second. What the scoping provision says, what have you done? You've had to take some step to bring what you're doing within the scope of the code. And the words that are used is, have you constructed something? Have you done an alteration to something? Have you enlarged it? Use and occupancy and location. Arguably, I think you could make the argument that placing them is locating it on the site. That might be enough to bring it into the scope. Here, we didn't really go down that road because they've done something more than that. They've taken that and they've added the roof structure to it. So to me, that's the big issue for tonight. And I think it's a much closer question. It's one that we frankly didn't even dive into that closely. If it was just the shipping container. If it was there temporarily, there's no question, it's not a structure. If it's there permanently and they want to cut in windows, they want to do
Right.
one of those simple homes. So you start to do alterations to it, something like that, you're now in the code.
And those have foundations under them too, so that's.
Yeah.
that's a
Some do,
different-
some don't. So this one
Here doesn't have a foundation underneath it.
I have a question. With a building of this nature on the storage facilities, if they are required to get a permit, I think, would the roof structure of this be required for engineering to the city as far as the engineering of the roof, how it's attached and so on?
That is correct. It would require that per the building code. It goes in and talks about when you get into category 1 structures, which this falls under, that the attachment would have to be engineered, the welding would have to be checked, because we as city inspectors, we don't have those qualifications, so that would have to be checked to make sure that that it's going to hold up, that when a windstorm picks up, it doesn't take it off and lay it out in the freeway when people are in there loading things into that storage structure, that the snow load, wind load doesn't cave it in on somebody that's in there. So it would be required for them to provide uplift
okay.
and attachment requirements.
Now, with the height of the structure and some of the materials that are stored in there, is there also any requirements of how high they are able to stack in a facility like that also?
To answer that question is really tough, because I would have to know what exact material they're putting in there. There is material that is required. You can only stack it so high, depending on what it falls in the building code. If it's a flammable material or combustible material and falls under the category in the chart, you'd have to go up to 12 feet.
And how high is the structure to the?
I don't know.
Okay.
I really don't know. Just if, a quick assessment of me, I'm guessing.
I think it's pretty.
Guessing it's 20, 25 feet, just by looking at the pallets there. Those structures are about, the storage containers are about, 7.5, 8 feet tall. So you look inside of that, if you put another one on top of it, 18, 20, 25 foot, somewhere around there. I don't know, because I've never been able to measure it. Mr. Tipton would probably be able to tell you more closer how tall it is, but from our first picture, and you see in the pallets, kind of gives you a good idea that, looks like there's 4 bundles on that pallet, that I would imagine each one of those bundles is approximately a foot tall or more. So, it's real tough from the picture to tell how tall it is. You can see from one of the pictures we have there, you can see the structure in front of it. If you want to go to that one, you can see the structure in front of that, and it's, well over the top of those.
These give you a sense of the scale. You can see the pole building in the background. Looks to be roughly the same height there, and then you look at this one, it's roughly the same height of that building beside it. So they're not insignificant, which in some ways highlights part of the reason why we think this is important. We have in no way want to suggest that Mr. Tipton would try to do something fast and loose and get something done, but these structures are sitting right next to the freeway. And we just lived through 2 big windstorms this fall where things were blown all over the place. We want to make sure that it's constructed safely. We want to make sure that these things are firmly attached to the shipping containers and that they're not going to blow away. It's God forbid one of them gets loose and lands on the freeway.
Yeah, I was looking at the way the structures are going to shed the snow and come down. I mean, it's going to slide off fairly easy.
Onto the top of the
It's going
shipping
to start
container.
stacking
Right.
up and then put the inner pressure
Correct.
on there, and it's just looking at the how it was attached.
If you went back, what he was looking at, where it comes down over the top there on both sides, it's
Yeah.
gonna pile up in the center and then put undue pressure to
Right.
the tubings.
One of you had asked about foundations. Is a foundation going to be required? The answer is we don't know. As a starting point, I think the answer is yes. However, we think that their engineers can probably find a way around that. But we need to make sure that they're adequately anchored. They're not, that those weights and loads are supported. We think the engineers can get that, but as a starting point, they would need to have a foundation unless they can provide the engineering that shows that they're good to go. And we think that's doable.
So you feel like there's a pretty good chance that if this is required to get a building permit, that there's a remediation or a solution? I mean, I guess I can't pinpoint you to say yes or no definitively, but short, rather than removing everything and starting over.
Oh, yeah.
What the building code says is he could go back to the engineer, and the engineer would start obviously down at the soils, figure out what the bearing pressure of the soil is, and then the container sitting on top of the soil, and then the wind load and snow loads that are going to come down on top of that, making sure all of that will
Okay, that makes sense.
transfer down. I think it's doable, but like I said, I'm not an engineer,
Right.
and I can't do those calculations for him.
Yeah, we definitely think there's a path forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Any other questions? I think I'll leave up a photo for you in case Mr. Tipton wants to refer to it as we get going forward to the end here.
You gonna use this, Jack? Okay, so it'll take that off of there.
Okay, never mind then. So while he's coming up, let me pull out that definition you'd asked about. So real property for the property tax code is defined as lands and all rights and
How do we need?
privileges thereto belonging anywhere
5,
appertaining.
7.
So it's essentially, it's the dirt, the land, it's the real property.
There's that, I got another.
And then also for fixtures, fixtures are those articles that, although once movable as chattel, have become accessory to and part of the improvements to real property by having been physically incorporated therein in such a manner that removing them would cause material injury or damage to the property. So you've done something to affix them in a way that it's not easily undone for tax purposes, to become a fixture.
Here's mine. Pointer.
Or maybe not. All right,
Pocket.
we'll live without it. Got a marker.
Do you want to go get one? I
We're
can.
fine.
Probably not going to get a lot of attention until people look through that if they want to.
Falling on the ground.
But Warren spent a lot of time, I think, trying to turn my containers into real property, and there just is no evidence that there's any way that those are real property unless and until I permanently affix them to the land. There just isn't, and I'm going to beat that horse a couple different ways. The first one being, I have to insure all this. Is my insurance company, is it a building? Is it my property? What is it? My insurance guy tells me it's personal property. Guess I should. Because here, this is my insurance company, Liberty Mutual, and my agent, Tim Warner. We went to the head commercial appraiser for Kootenai County and talked to him about the containers and the shade canopies attached between them. And he said under no circumstances are those improvements to real property. They wouldn't be taxed as such. And they're, unless and until I attach them permanently to my property, they are not real property. If I sold that parcel, the containers, the shade canopies, and my inventory there would not pass with title to the land unless it was negotiated in addition to real property. I think Warren was rather dishonest on what West versus El Paso was. The Supreme Court, if you go beyond the passage he gave you, it determines that the granulator was already real property. Then it was improved, and therefore it was an improvement to real property, just like the words say. But it also
again, from this Supreme Court decision, says, you know, it tells you what real property is. Lands and that which is affixed to the land. Another part of the property or project that you have to do is figure out how you're going to depreciate it. What rules govern my depreciation? And so you've got the modified accelerated cost system that I went to my accountant and we looked this up. And again, they say, unless it's inherently permanent, it's not a building that I would have to depreciate over the 40 years like you would elsewhere. And if you, I'm trying to go back and forth because I don't have my computer. Like I said, if it's readily disassembled and moved, it's personal property. And so my containers with the shade canopies stretched between them certainly fit that. My accountant thought it'd be easily defensible were it ever to come to litigation that this is just personal property. And we depreciated it, or will depreciate it as such when it goes into service. And the email from Warren seems like forever ago. Gave me the definition of the structure that they were working at and highlighted it both on the copy from his annotated book as well as in his email, and made it a point that the scope of building code is improvements to real property. And the definition of a scope is the extent of its influence. The extent of the influence of the building code is to improvements to real property. And that's where I think we've been at loggerheads forever. Is what I've done is an improvement to personal property. I have not magically created real property because I have attached nothing to the ground. And Warren went over this, but I will as well. God, that's a really bad glare, isn't it? Oh well, but
It's clear from here.
okay. It's already been decided that what I have done is not a structure per the Post Falls ordinance, the 18.12.01. They did agree that what I erected is not on the ground or attached to something with a fixed location on the ground. That's been decided. And so it is not a structure per the local definition of structure. And then, of course, the building code one, the more expansive, that which is built or constructed. But Warren also tries to erect some kind of firewall between zoning ordinances and building ordinances, but they're fairly well interconnected. I mean, it's the same way that you go to the taxing activity to try to justify your building activity law. The zoning ordinance does inform it and is part of it. I mean, it uses the same words, build, construct, erect. That it has nothing to say about structures is hard, I mean, especially for your business people, when they're using the words in there, that it has to. I mean, I use this for the zoning one too. If you draw the Venn diagram of that which is built or constructed versus that which is erected or constructed but attached, either is on the ground or attached to a structure, you see that there is that green sliver on the outside that Post Falls chose not to consider a structure. That means something to me. It has consequences to me. That Post Falls has chosen, there are some things that it doesn't consider a structure. And that's already been decided previously. We did that. And so what's a person to do if you have two definitions? I mean, one of them has to apply. And there's only one guidance on how to figure out which one. I mean, they keep saying that I'm trying to nullify the building code, and that's not true. I'm just saying that the building code can't nullify the local law, which is what it says. It can't render that local provision of our local law worthless, of no consequence. I mean, if we were to let the building code snap it back, then it did. It has rendered what's already been decided, that this is not a structure per the local ordinance. Which brings you to the scope of the ordinances. I mean, the zoning ordinance has a larger scope than the building, and it covers the use of the entire incorporated section of Post Falls, whereas the building code only does a smaller subset of it, which is just the building or that which is built or constructed. I mean, there are things that the zoning ordinance handles, such as shade cloth structures for nurseries, that the building code ignores. But I can't think of a reason why there should be something that the building code thinks is important that the zoning ordinance doesn't. And the good question is, if it's not a structure, when the question is, where can I build it? Then how could it be a structure if the question is when I build it or if I build it? I mean, just from somebody that doesn't live, eat, breathe building codes, I mean, if it matters simply the question of where can I build it rather than if I build it, I mean, that's the kind of problems this creates if you want to think that there can be two definitions for the same word, the same metal attached to my containers. Is you have questions like this. Who can answer that? I mean, you have to guess at the answer, and that's one of the, this is my hand scribbled note there, but that's in a civil context. A law is unconstitutional when a person of average intelligence must guess at the meaning, which is where we are today. I mean, if the other laws does not say that the building code cannot nullify that local definition of structure, then we wind up with flowcharts like this, which is essentially what they're saying your business people have to do. Is it a structure? Is it a structure? And if the answer is both yes and no, where are we? Then you also have questions like this. You know, it says if you are intending to build a structure, you need to get a building permit. Well, where does intending stop? You know, at the planning stage, it wasn't a structure. where at the point at which I'm intending to do it, I'm not a structure. I don't know where in the timeline do you switch? You have to guess? I mean, that's the quandary that I'm in. If there can be two definitions for the same word, what is a person to do? So we're back to this. Is the scope of the building code by its own connotation, the extent of its influence, just the improvements to real property? Because what I've done is not improve the real property. It may be an improvement to my personal property, but it's not an improvement to real property. It won't be taxed that way. We've talked to the chief appraiser. This is just a temporary solution until I can grow into a full-on building on that whole parcel. And that's the end of it. Does anybody have any questions?
The specific word that you were wondering had two meanings is what?
Structure. I mean, we can go back. I had them side by side. The red one is your local law, using almost identical words. Erected or constructed, which requires location on the ground or attachment to something with a fixed location on the ground. And that has been decided that what I am doing is not a structure per the local definition of structure. And then the building code is that which is built or constructed. And so when you overlay them, you've got that sliver of erected or constructed, but not on the ground or not attached to something with a fixed location on the ground.
So you're saying that the roof is not on the ground?
Correct.
That's
what is erected or constructed. It's the shade canopies. They're just attached to my containers, which are just laying on the ground. I agree it's tough, but
And what's your definition of the containers? Is that what you're saying is personal property?
it is personal property. It's on my personal property tax bill, the commercial appraiser.
So do you intend to move it around frequently or pull it away and cart those off and put new ones in every so often with new items in it or anything?
The point at which I move these will be when I'm ready to do a building. I mean, this is kind of a temporary incremental growth. I mean, I was able to inventory another 150,000 pounds of pipe this winter.
So it's not really a shipping yard where you're going to be carting in containers in and out with trucks?
No.
You see a shipping yard on a
No,
dock
we're going
or
to be
something like
bringing pallets of pipe back and forth.
The interim period before, what you have now before you build a building, will it be within a 180-day time period? Or do you have any idea?
Oh, it'll take a couple of years to acquire enough customers where that amount of storage isn't enough. And so it'll be more than 180 days, but hopefully less than 10 years.
I had a question on, as far as the construction of the canopy, did you have an engineer kind of help you design what you do have there? Or
Oh, I-
one of your maintenance workers helped construct this, or
No, this was a product we purchased.
a product that you purchased made to go onto the containers?
Correct. I mean, it came with those feet that we welded onto the container. And
Is it specific for those containers, for those feet to be welded on there? Or is that made to attach to a ground, to like a foundation?
you could do either, depending on what your use is. I mean, you can order a different kind of mounting point, or you'd want to set some concrete pillars into the ground and then attach it to a footing.
Or do the containers, do they currently have any pipe in them? Are you using those also for storage, or is this just being used as construction as a wall or a base?
There is storage, there is some pipe in them, and there's other, and some of them have used equipment that is not currently in service, but certainly is still viable if we need it.
I think the building codes are, I know, to help protect, say when I buy a building, you buy a building, or I buy a house, to make sure everything is, number one thing is safe.
Right,
you
it's
know?
to protect the next person.
Exactly. It's safety's number one, and then we go by looks of, does it fit into is it in the right location or whatever. But the concern I have is as far as the safety of the structure and its surrounding area and property. With it, really, it's not engineered to the containers, and it sits up rather high. And with the canopy on that and the membrane, personally, for me, I have a concern of the wind, the snow load, far as for your employees, or the freeway right there. That's where I'm.
Well, frankly, I mean, that's a concern for anything. I've driven around and not even looking, and I've seen no less than 3 different fences with those privacy slats that is required by the building department blown over. And those are the only fences I've seen blown over, are the ones with the privacy slats, but yet that's still required. And actually, it was required of my fence. And so it's,
Is that a concern for you at all, though? If a fence is going to blow over, will a structure like this have a higher potential of blowing over?
a higher potential. I mean, it's just, I don't know how to answer that. It's perfectly fine to require slatted fences that get blown over. Nobody has suggested that we change that.
I think though that the safety of the difference of a 6-foot fence versus a structure that's 25 feet high.
Well, I think the only thing that could possibly happen is the membrane would, I'm sure, break long before the metal. And so at worst, you have a tarp. I mean, they lasted all winter through the windstorms, find the metal there.
Yeah, as far as the construction that you've done for this last winter?
Yeah, I mean, it's been, like the pictures you see there, has been
Right.
there since November.
Right. The biggest difference is though that it doesn't have the membrane on it, so virtually it doesn't have any stress on it at all.
Well, no, it did not this winter.
It looks to me that on the construction for the canopy, and I've seen these canopies before like this, but it looks like the bracket, you weld it or you put it down and then it bolts into a foundation. There's 4 bolts through there. I blew up my picture and I can see how it, as the structure's coming down, you have the bracket and you have it welded like this, and it looks like it's sitting on like an eye to where it can tip or do this.
It's welded on 3 sides.
Right.
On the back and both sides.
The bracket is to the container. Oh,
Any
picture
chance
up
I
there.
can come around and,
Yeah, you
so we
bet.
can,
Let's see.
What does your insurance company feel about it? mean, you have this note here from your insurance. I mean, you're the one that's liable for any problem with this, whether,
Well, is true, except that I've been told that everybody else in this room, or at least at that table, is also liable. But I would think that Justin would only be liable were it within the scope of the building code, and he allowed it. And so that is a question to you today, is anybody here think this is an improvement to real property or an improvement to personal property? I mean, that's the simple question you have to answer. Is it an improvement to real or an improvement to the personal? Because
I personally feel like there there is a lot of gray area in it. And we can all see that just from the definition of words. I feel that as a building official, their primary goal is to look at safety of the public. And so if I was in Justin's shoes, I don't feel that this structure is safe for the public at all. And it seems like a highly creative way of just trying intentionally to bypass the permitting process, and I don't understand why. I realize that might not be the scope of what we're doing here tonight, but
well, the permitting process triggers a bunch of permanent stuff that isn't necessary, or at least as it was always described to me, where you have to asphalt the whole thing. One of them being, I mean, that's 6 figures of useless money for an outdoor storage yard.
well, all I heard Justin mention tonight was referencing items that would be
And if
particular
it
to
was just
safety.
a building permit,
Wind loads.
I don't think I'd be here.
And I think our job here tonight is to determine if it meets according to the building code and not be involved in any of the zoning ordinance issues.
I agree.
Because that's a planning and
I mean,
zoning issue.
my
believe.
question to you is, did what I do an improvement to real property and therefore within the scope of the building code or not?
Well, I think Justin had talked about what, and correct me if I'm wrong, the containers that were placed there weren't so much of a problem. It's when the structure was constructed on the containers, joining them and welding them together. I think that's what took it over the threshold.
Well, they haven't been welded together. You know, the brackets are
Well,
welded on.
technically, though, these are all bolted and welded from container to container, so this is all one. And I think that's where where all this came about, is when the containers were there, okay, but now we have a structure
We don't
connected
have a
together
structure.
that
'Cause
does not have a permit and does not have engineering.
That's
And I
the
think
part
that's
of
where
it.
that threw it over the threshold.
You know, I already did this. It's not a structure to the city of Post Falls per your own ordinance. And that is one of the hardest parts about this, is that, you know, the city passed its own definition of structure. And I need a building permit to erect a structure. And I agree, it's almost for sure heading above here.
I'll just remind everybody, we'll all have a chance to deliberate before we make a decision. And so if we have questions just addressed for Mr. Tipton, that's probably best, but we can talk it amongst ourselves after that process too, just by the way, for what it's worth. So, any other questions? I think we can hear a rebuttal.
yeah, we're gonna be here all night. Or else we're gonna be here all night.
Just as a point, do I get one more if they bring up something that I want to discuss?
No,
No?
this runs sort of like a court. Each party gets one shot at the apple, and because we didn't get to hear what you had to say up front, we get to respond to what you said. So we'll try to be quick here. So you've heard, could you bring back the PowerPoint for me? So you've heard that he visited the Planning Commission, and the city's own definition of structure is the one that's found in the zoning code. The problem with that is the city has two definitions of structure. The building code is a local code. It is adopted by the city. While it's promulgated by a national entity, the city has the opportunity to change elements that are in the building code. The city didn't do that in this case. So both of these, IBC 202 and the municipal code section, are city definitions of structure. They're adopted for different reasons. They cover different items. You saw in Mr. Timpton's handouts, he's wondering, well, there's multiple definitions of improvements to real property, and there are. We're happy to admit that. And we pointed out at least 4 different definitions of improvement to real property. He's provided a couple more to you. And I would argue that's on purpose, because different codes do different things. The tax code is addressing something different than how you invest your funds if you're an insurance company. Those are different things. And so each definition, while they share some similarities, they're not all the same. They cover different things. So the Supreme Court, they look at the dictionary, and that, in no way were we trying to say that the Supreme Court was answering this question for the building code. We were just showing you how the Supreme Court went about answering the question of what an improvement is. They turned to the dictionary. They said, what is it? What is an improvement in the dictionary? So if you look at those 3 different definitions, so you've got this definition of improvement to real property, which is, does it enhance or augment the value or quality of the property? Here, the answer is yes. Again, it doesn't require that it be affixed to the property. That's not required. Mr. Tipton seems to believe that improvement to real property automatically requires it to somehow be affixed to the dirt. Not required on any of the examples we showed you. It's not required in the building code. So when we're interpreting the building code, and like I said, we want to get this right. We take this very seriously. Justin looked at multiple examples of different ways of looking at this. None of them that we looked at required physically that the property be affixed. For the assessment purposes, you heard reference to, well, the assessor said that this won't be real property. And we acknowledge that. We talked with the assessor's office as late as today, and they confirmed for us the statute that we're citing to you is the statute that governs assessments in Idaho. That statute, again, doesn't require that it be affixed to real property. It can be simply erected on property. While Kootenai County has elected to use a narrower scope, if you go over to Shoshone County, you go to Bonner, Boundary, this statute, it could be taxed as real property. Whether Kootenai County elects to do that or not, that's a second question. It could be taxed as real property because it's an improvement to real property under their own definition. For building code purposes, the focus really is, again, on the use. We think that we've shown that they've taken steps to improve, alter those shipping containers. If you think about it, in some ways, if you look at those, the photos of the homes, it's just a different type of construction. It's no different than somebody building a stick-built home. They just used a container and cut in openings. They put in plumbing fixtures, electrical. It's a different type of construction. Here, rather than building stick-built walls, they've used the shipping containers as a wall to which they've mechanically attached through welding a new roof structure, which renders you, it's like you've taken the 2x4s and the various pieces and you've now assembled them together. You've created a structure that's subject to the code. Just the container is a different question. This is a different thing than just the container sitting on the real property. Any other?
Just to, touch on too, I've also, just so you guys know, I also contacted other jurisdictions, the county, Kootenai County Building Department, Coeur d'Alene, Hayden, all over. I went down into Colorado, all those guys, and they all gave them pictures and they all looked at it and came to the same determination I did, as it would be a structure per the building code and be regulated. I didn't find any building department that said, no, we wouldn't regulate that. So once again, like I said, I wanted to do my research, make sure that I wasn't the only person thinking this way, and that I've found obviously from Steve Thomas himself, also in his letter that you guys also have, that my determination when I come through kind of falls in line with somebody that writes the books, sits through all the code collaborates, and makes the codes.
Maybe you don't know, but is there power or anything in, is there power in any of these buildings, or?
We don't know. We don't know that.
No, there's not.
So one last point before we get to the punchline again. Going back to the idea of it having to be affixed, as we said, we don't think that's required under the definition or any of the definitions we've shown you. Having said that, we're not clear at this point whether it will be required to be affixed. That's something that the engineers are going to tell us once they've submitted for the building permit. It may well end up affixed to the real property. You don't know that. In some ways, this is cart before the horse. We won't know that until they come in, apply for the permit, provide the engineering data, and then we'll know whether it has to be affixed. But whether or not it is required, the code doesn't require it to be affixed to be an improvement to real property. So back to the punchline for tonight. Your job is to now figure this all out, to weigh through what this means. You've heard both sides. Again, your job is to make a decision. It'll be a majority vote from the board. You can only overturn the building official determination if he has somehow misinterpreted or misapplied the code requirements. That's the standard you're looking for. So with that, we'll sit down and let you get to it.
We would
Unless
like
there's more
to,
questions.
we would like to request a 2 to 3 minute water break, if that's okay.
Yeah.
It's been asked, if that's all right.
That's fine by me.
Convene in just very short.
Yeah.
Quick break. Okay, we're back on the air. So this is the time we can deliberate, and I guess we can start at one end and work our way down. And who wants to start?
You bet.
Daryl?
Yeah,
Give your thoughts, comments?
I just look at a variety of it, and like I had mentioned previously, I do think there's a little bit of gray area. However, the closers for me are the fact that the code references specifically to membrane-covered frame structures, and I think partly we're getting hung up a little bit too much on whether they sit on containers or not. The fact is, I mean, these are membrane-covered frame structures, and by the code, it appears to me that they fall under the permit process.
Makes sense. Your thoughts?
I agree. My concern is the same as follows, and just the safety, and just you can't underestimate the weather, as we've seen, and just maybe just safety issues with as far as I understand that the structure is engineered to a point, but as we go on to the containers, it's a whole different ball game. So I would.
I look at it, the building code is to protect life and the safety of others around it, but also occupants, people that are working in there, anybody that, a kid that jumps the fence and walks through, whether he's allowed to or not, anybody. And so you look at the code, and don't quote me on this, I think signs over 6 feet needs engineering, and fences need permits, and you start looking at things like that, and the reason those heights are there is because that's when it starts hurting people, hurts you on the head when they fall over. And I'm thinking of that, if that fell over, it probably hurt you on the head. Kind of a silly example, but that's the way I'm synthesizing it. And it seems permanent. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's going to move around, every week, or there's not trucks coming in to grab it. You don't lift those things up with forklifts, like I'm thinking of a lumber yard or something like that. It's not on wheels. You can't drag it around easily. So they feel, you could argue that it's semi-permanent, but I think you'd have to use the word permanent. And then as far as insurance, and if there's no insurance coverage, I don't know if that's really an argument for me here. Zoning, if it needs paving and street trees in front of it and sidewalks and all of that, I don't know. If it doesn't, then that's money saved. If it does, then it does. I just don't know if we have to make those decisions. And then I guess the other thing is I like the idea of getting people, their business being successful and moving on with it. I wouldn't like the idea if this all had to just get pulled away. It seems to me like there's a solution, and that's important to me. If there's a solution that you can get an engineer to look at it and get this thing to work, that's good. So I value that. I was involved in a project. It was a pellet mill, and it had huge tubes, and it had a vapor barrier over it, and it needed a full code review and engineering, and it had sawdust stored underneath it. And so I've seen that something very similar to this where this has occurred. And so those are my thoughts.
Well, in my opinion, this is an improvement to the property. And the building department is for building safety. And I think this requires a permit for safety because I see some inherent problems. Kind of how it boils down to me.
Well, I really appreciate your time and that you put into this. The problem for me would be what was pointed out in the membrane structure. That I can see this as not being real property, and I can go with you there. But the problem is, if you look at the section 3102, it says that you have the erection period of time would be 180 days. And so I don't think you're going to go through all this for 180 days. Yeah, but I mean, in looking at it, I don't see that that's what the purpose would be. And I would have to agree that you would need a permit on it.
So it says, and you could jump in, maybe help with the recommended action or motion.
So at this point, if deliberations are finished, you'd need a motion. If it sounds like based on the deliberation is to deny the appeal, I think that would be the appropriate motion, which would be seconded and then voted on. Alternatively, if I'm hearing you wrong, you would make a motion to sustain the appeal and overrule the building official. So one of those two motions would be on the table.
We'll hear a motion and second it if somebody wants to make it.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I make a motion that he needs to get a building permit
So we would take that as a motion to deny the appeal.
to deny the appeal.
And I will second that. You want to take a roll call?
Wilder,
Do I say
It's
yes?
an aye or nay or yes or
Aye.
no?
Schmidt,
Aye.
Latham,
Aye.
Miller,
Aye.
Barnhart.
Aye.
Motion is carried.
So that would be it for tonight. The next motion would be to adjourn.
I would make a motion to adjourn if somebody wants to second that.
I think.
Second that.
We're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
again
guys
for
for your
tonight.
time.